and welcome from my little space here in Vienna. My name is Luise, I'm a literature student and writer, and today I thought let's talk about academic writing. I recently submitted my master thesis and I'm currently waiting for my grade and then for my master exam and defensio. Sometimes it's nice to romanticize your work, but there are many not so glamorous sides that I want to talk about today. I wrote about female authorship in the Viennese modernism and looked at publication and production conditions for 3 different authors here in Vienna. I'm going to speak about my own experience, so it might be very different for other students, but some of the things probably are a lot more common than one might think. The first aspect is that I read a lot of articles and books that I didn't end up needing, and especially at the beginning when you start to get a feeling for the topic, it is kind of important to have a lot of overview, and then you realize, okay, this is very interesting and it's also sort of part of my topic, but I won't be needing it, or at least you won't quote this source. And it can be a little frustrating sometimes because it feels like you put a lot of time into reading something that will not end up in your thesis, but it helps to build a very strong backbone, even though it can be very frustrating. The second aspect is procrastination. As a student, you really succeed in procrastination. It's wild sometimes, all the things that you start doing while you should be writing a thesis or studying for an exam, and I kind of started to acknowledge it as part of the process. I felt very bad at times when I started to clean my apartment or just sat on my phone scrolling through Instagram instead of doing something productive. But I also knew that there would be the moment where I would start, maybe with a little bit of time pressure and with a little bit of stress. I usually know that I can manage, and if not, I had people I could talk to and help me reflect on my methods and maybe where I could improve. Sometimes it's important to get professional help. At university, you can also book an appointment where you can talk about such things and where you can maybe make a plan how to overcome this. But it's a really big obstacle, and for some people it feels almost impossible, but you're definitely not alone in this. Procrastination is a big aspect of studying, and I think to a certain extent it's normal. For me, it always helped to talk to people about it and also to have hard deadlines. This is a big one. I'm not very good with anything that I set myself. This is going to be another point later. Okay, the next 2 aspects are a bit in the same category. It's on the one hand that I usually had over 20 tabs open on my laptop, and I also had around 50 books at home from the library. It made me feel like a crazy person, but everything felt so important, like I can't close this tab, what if I'll need it later on? For a person on the outside, it might look very overwhelming, but there are situations where it's quite necessary. Same with books, but I did have a moment where I kind of lost control over everything I had at home, and I felt like I hope that when I return the last book that it will actually be the last one and that there isn't one missing somewhere, but I managed to do that. I returned all my books last week, so that was a success and everything was fine. But I also had that many books at home because the public library is having some renovations, and therefore it was closed for a couple of months, and they advised to make any reservation before that. Suddenly I had a library at home. The next one is you won't read all of the books that you borrow, and some of them will go back unread. Sometimes you will only read a few pages because no one can actually read all of it, even though it feels like you need to read everything, and it often feels very hard to decide what is important. This is part of academic writing and research, but it can be so difficult because it's a never-ending story. You will always find something else that might kind of fit into your research, and yeah, sometimes you just have to say, okay, I'm gonna stop here. I have the important information that I need, and maybe this article from some kind of author is also helpful, but I'm gonna exclude it. At the beginning of studying, I was always confused how people would read all of those books, and a professor usually gives you a list with secondary literature for a course, and I was like, are they reading every single page? It's like books with a few hundred pages. How is anyone doing this? And every chapter felt so important, but obviously you just have to learn how to browse through and how to decide what's important and what's not, which also takes up quite a lot of time and can feel a little intimidating. Moving on to citation. No matter how long I studied and how many courses I had on academic writing and on research and citation, there are still situations where I really lose my mind over it and where I try to make a decision on how to cite something, because every department has their own rules and it can get a little confusing sometimes. They have their style sheets, but there is always some special case missing, and then you sit there like, what do I do now? And suddenly you start questioning everything that you've ever cited. Citation takes a lot of time. It's that little side effect that you have to deal with that is not maybe your favorite thing, but it's there and it's important. You have to deal with it nonetheless. While I would question all my citations, I was also questioning my topic all the time and everything that I had already written. So this was also part of the process. It happened all the time that I sat there and was like, does this actually make sense? And then I would reread a few paragraphs and I was like, I'm not sure. Is this even like my topic? Is this my research question? Does it actually answer it? It's this big, a little bit irrational fear in school when you write something in German class and you're like, is this maybe off topic, and am I still answering what is required? And I also had that with my topic, even though I felt like kind of still makes sense. But then, you have this little voice in your head that's quite consistently asking you, but are you sure? Is this really what you're supposed to do? You obviously have a supervisor that assists you and where you can ask questions. But sometimes, and I've heard this from a lot of different people, it's quite difficult to stay in contact with your supervisor. And it happens quite often that you send your emails out into the void and you are frequently ghosted by your professor. On the one hand, I understand it. They have a lot on their hands and some students don't write for a couple of months and then all of a sudden they want an answer. But also, you're my supervisor and I just need your help, I'm kind of relying on your help a little bit. This can be very frustrating and also delay your work, obviously, when you need a certain answer to continue. Speaking of frustration, and what I already mentioned is deadlines. I set myself a lot of deadlines and I didn't stick to any of it. I think the last deadline that I set myself was the day where I finally want to do the online submission, and I managed to do that with quite a lot of stress. I'm hoping to hand it in 3 days. I kind of made myself the deadline because I am so done with it in a good way. If you're interested in that, you can watch my submission vlog, but I had a hard time to really follow my deadlines, mostly because they were quite unrealistic, to be completely honest. I didn't have a proper deadline for my master thesis, so I was making up the whole timeline myself. The professors are very individual, the way they handle it. Some are very consistent, saying, I want one chapter by, I don't know, this date. And others are really like, do your thing, just text me whenever you feel like it. And I was struggling with that because whenever I felt like now is the time to hand something in and I didn't manage it and it wasn't finished yet, I was really frustrated with myself, which was obviously not very constructive. I just needed to learn to be a little bit more realistic and not forget that life is still happening around me, and that even though my master thesis is my main priority, there are other obligations that I have as well and that take up time. So yeah, and the whole fantasy of writing a master thesis in one semester and to be done in the minimum time is usually very uncommon. There are definitely people who manage that, but the majority of people is not able to do that. When I asked my professor if it's possible to write the thesis in one semester, I could see in her eyes that she was like, I mean, it's possible, but you probably won't. Like everyone else usually takes a lot more time. I also think that this is a bit misleading by the university here. I already talked about that in my previous video. The whole process of writing the thesis felt a little bit lonely sometimes, which might sound a bit weird because I had a lot of people who were very interested. I shared a lot on my channel here. People always kept asking how it is, and I made vlogs. I have lots of friends who are also in academics and who are also writing their master theses right now. So there was definitely a lot of communication and people I could talk to. But in the end, you were the one sitting at your table alone mostly and trying to solve all the problems. And the topics are often very specific that even if a person is kind of, interested in it, it's sometimes hard to explain what you are actually doing. And just this whole experience is so intense, or at least that's how it was for me. Maybe it's not that big of a deal for other people, but for me it was, and I was sometimes, I guess, a bit overwhelmed with it, and also sometimes a bit burned out. So it was hard for me to feel all the positive energy that I got from other people, and I really had to remind myself, hey, you're not alone in this, and your friend is going through the exact same time. Go and meet her at the library to not feel that alone. This leads me to my next point. I mentioned this before quite a few times, but I think the biggest issue for me and the hardest thing was balancing my work life, writing all my theses, and my free time. Technically, you can write every single day, the whole year round. I had a rather revealing moment where I realized I can't go on the way I did, and I have to shift my perspective and the way I create my timetable. It was Christmas, and here in Austria we celebrate on the 24th of December, and it was in the morning and there was not much going on. All of our family activities would start a bit later. So I had a little bit of time, and the thing I thought about was I could sit down and do something for uni. And then I realized, whoa, I have to back down, I have to take a breath and remind myself that I don't have to do anything for university on a family vacation day that is actually one of my favorite holidays of the whole year. And I love celebrating Christmas so much. And then I was like, yeah, this is not how it's done. This is not healthy. And I really have to set boundaries and tell myself, there are specific days where I'm not going to do anything for university, even though it's hard and even though my brain still keeps working and running, and sometimes I feel a bit guilty of not doing anything on a free day, but still I have to have my breaks. Yeah, that was pretty difficult for me, and something that I don't know from, having a normal job where you just go and then you work and then you go home and you just move on with your life, and where working life and free time is very separated. With student life, that's just not the case. The next aspect is similar to that the brain keeps working no matter what. But this is not only negative, it's sometimes also a little bit funny. When I had a very intense working day where, let's say, I went to the library at 9 a.m. and had a little break in between, but stayed there for, 4 p.m. and I was really working on a chapter or a paragraph, and I was in my hyper focus. And then I would go outside, and it was sometimes so hard to have a proper conversation with someone that had nothing to do with my thesis or with anything university related. I was sometimes feeling like an alien, like it was really difficult to form a proper sentence and to really pull myself out of this hyperfocus. I felt like I was in this parallel world, and my brain was still thinking of how can I structure this paragraph and what article am I going to read next. And then I would see my flatmate or talk to my family on the phone, and I had to remind myself to land in the real world again. I could always share aspects of my thesis, they were always interested, but still this kind of shift from hyperfocus to normal daily life and activities was sometimes a bit weird and funny, and kind of interesting how much the brain really falls into something. Something that happened to me quite often, where I really, every single time when it happened, I felt like next time I will do a better job and it won't happen again. But it happened all the time. I read a document and felt like, okay, this information is not that important, I'm not gonna mark it. Then you move on, and later on you're like, I've read this somewhere and now I need it, but I can't find it anymore. And the hardest thing is when you don't even remember the book that it was in. And this takes up a lot of time, finding the sources again. Because even when you have a really good system, it just happens that some information doesn't seem to be that relevant in the moment you read it. Or you just have lots of other thoughts at the same time and then it just slips away. That's just what happens, but it can be really annoying. My last point is that there are many days where you only work on a few sentences, sometimes not even a full paragraph, and it took you several hours, and that's it for the day. And I really want to highlight that what you see online when people make study vlogs and writing vlogs and whatever, it's only one part of the story, and it might seem like they are the most productive people. You know, when I upload a vlog, I obviously can only show you some snippets and also try to make it interesting for you and aesthetically pleasing. So it's only natural that you won't see me sitting there in my pajama with unwashed hair, working on the same paragraph for hours and hours. But this is probably what happens for the majority of time. So if you feel unproductive and you watch such a vlog, keep that in mind, that this is just a snippet. I'm not going to the library every day. There are many days where I don't have the energy. We have quite a few library vlogs, but this is not my everyday. I don't always have the motivation to go. Sometimes I'm very determined the day before, and then in the morning I wake up, I'm like, I don't want to go outside. And then I'm staying at home instead, not being productive at all. That happens quite often. I hope I could bring some perspective into this topic without complaining too much, but just showing you some of the aspects that might not be as obvious. I would love to hear what topics you are currently researching on, if you're studying for something special, or maybe you're also writing a paper or a thesis at the moment. Write down in the comments what you are currently dealing with. I would love to read it. And maybe you can even relate to one of the things that I mentioned in the video. It is time to finish my tea, and I'll see you in my next video. Until then, I hope you have a really nice time. Goodbye. My beep 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 beep. A bit sweaty. Ugh.